Tonight on Dateline.
When a murder is discovered.
What you have is a young lady who is in a suitcase which has been deposited on a railway embankment, covered over by twigs and other foliage.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
And then you find out what really happened. You read it in books, you see it in TV shows and everything else. It's really tough. Well, there isn't a day go by that you don't remember something.
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now and they say they've never got over it, what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
That was our hope, that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
In this episode, body parts are found on the streets of London.
In that bag were 2 parts of a leg, upper and lower. So we now had at least 3 legs.
I remember the police tape just being all across the estate, and the police teams were going into the drains and all tents up and everywhere.
Meet the murder detectives.
They could see the bedroom door closed. The officers went in. When they entered the room, they found something wrapped in bin liners, a hacksaw and 3 knives. Had the appearance almost of an altar.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
2 officers who turned up, gave chase, caught him, and he put up a tremendous fight.
Five days after Christmas 2002, the streets of London were quiet as the capital city prepared for one of the biggest nights of the year, New Year's Eve. But in a North London HQ of the Metropolitan Police, a very disturbing call came in.
The homicide assessment team phone rang at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Myself and a colleague fast-tracked down to outside a public house in Camden, where it had been reported that some human body parts had been found.
Brian Hook was the homicide assessment or HAT team leader that night.
My initial thoughts, whilst we were en route to there, were a myriad of things going through my head. I didn't know what the body parts were, I didn't know where they'd been found, so it really was a question of getting there as soon as we possibly could.
As the team raced to the scene, Commander Andy Baker, who was in charge of all homicide investigations in London, was brought up to speed.
I got a call from one of my detective chief superintendents. He told me that a tramp-like individual was looking for food, rummaging in some community bins, and he found a bag. He opened the bag up. At first he thought they were like fillets of something, I think fish, I'm not sure. But then when he pulled them out, he could clearly see that they were the calf muscles of the lower part of the legs. I then said, okay, what's the immediate kind of actions you're undertaking? He told me that Kenny Bell was a senior investigating officer, who I knew, I've known for years, very able, professional, brilliant SIO, and his team very good.
Brian was a key part of that team at the crime scene.
This is the general area that I arrived to on that morning. Where this wall is now, there used to be a back entrance way to the pub, and it was in there that the dustbin was, that the body parts were found. When I arrived, cordons had been set up by the first responders from uniform. I spoke to the officers that had been there, and in actual fact, I could actually see the body parts in the bin liner that had been torn open. One of the other factors when I arrived there was the smell of human decomposition.
To have dismembered body parts on the streets of the capital was a very unusual event, but this part of northwest London had its fair share of crime.
In 2002, Camden, very similar in many ways as it is today, vibrant, transient people coming, going through, lots of visitors, good pubs, but also had the, I wouldn't say underworld side, but a seedier side to it as well. Drugs, down and out, sleeping on the street, rubbish strewn around. And I came here on the 30th of December and I came over the days as well as the case continued. There's a good sense of community. You are in central London and literally 500 yards up the road you've got £3 million houses. Here you've got council apartments.
Being so close to Christmas, the streets were quiet, so a sudden police presence in the area attracted attention very quickly. Richard Osley is the deputy editor of the Camden New Journal newspaper.
People were shocked that this was happening on their doorstep, and they were nervous about the fact that the perpetrator behind this was apparently on the run, nowhere to be seen. I remember the police tape just being all across the estate, and the police teams were kind of going into the drains and all tents up and everywhere.
The police team began their investigation with the man who had found the body parts in the bin.
In all homicides, you work backwards. And we had a conversation about who the individual was that discovered the body parts, because obviously he would be a person of interest. So he was in a police station assisting us, but came to the conclusion, hold on, he's called police, he could have just left them there and walked away. He didn't. He did the right thing.
With no other witnesses, the team had to begin considering where the rest of the body may be. Forensic psychologist Julian Boone was brought in to consult on the case.
Usually, with dismembered body parts, there are one of two explanations. One is where the person who is the perpetrator has had to dispose of a body, possibly because there's been one almighty row and anger killing of the individual, say in a domestic violence dispute where someone has died. The second is because they get some form of kick out of it, and that is rooted in something known as necrophilia.
We talked about possibility of body snatchers, mortuary thieves, that kind of thing, but come to the conclusion that these were freshly cut legs and it was a deposit site.
At the crime scene, officers on the ground were carrying out house-to-house inquiries, searching for anything that could help identify where the body parts may have come from.
Every single door will be knocked on, the occupants will be identified, what they were doing at relevant times, and also what they know before the relevant times, because that is also what we need to know. What are the movements? What are the general movements around here?
The first 24 hours, 48 hours of any murder investigation are key. They call them the golden hours. So you have to act quickly to seal that scene, and you literally seal the scene. So you stop people going in and out. Anyone that does go in, their names are recorded.
The team called in more officers to cover as much of this part of Camden as they could.
We decided to put up a mobile police station so that people will see us there. Our focus was around Royal College Street. We needed to show a big presence there. We were in control, we were here, we are knocking on doors, we are searching.
The local people were already speculating that this was more than just another murder.
The impact on the community would quite clearly be very shocking and quite in the line with what I believe was the intention of the perpetrator, was to cause as much shock and anxiety as possible amid the local community, and to do what he could to emulate the London Ripper of over a century before.
On day 2 of the investigation, New Year's Eve, 31st December, quiet around this area, but we had extended our search of bins and house to house. And I was then told that we had found another bag, in fact the bin's further up, but this is Plender Street, found another bag with a small torso that could have been taken for a young girl. It wasn't, it was actually a woman in her 30s. Also in that bag were 2 parts of a leg, upper and lower. So we now had at least 3 legs and some long, dark, almost black hair.
And in this bin were body parts from 2 bodies, clearly indicating this wasn't some sort of domestic murder. This was somebody who was getting a kick out of doing that as the ultimate finale of their crime.
The discovery of a second load of body parts we found out about. We were actually on the scene, so we were kind of interviewing people on this day, and all of a sudden, later in that evening, the police start searching another bin.
It was obvious this was disposal. So that's why we extended the search of all bins, drains, areas, Regent's Canal, until we were satisfied that we couldn't find any more.
In this case that he dismembered the bodies, this can serve a few functions to the offender. One, it could be trying to get rid of evidence, so they're actually trying to destroy the body, literally, to get away with murder.
The police were now happy the streets were secure, but what they had found meant they had some very serious crimes on their hands.
There's concerns. We still had to satisfy ourselves that this was a murder. These could have been body parts taken from a graveyard, from a mortuary, recently buried, etc. So we soon realised that it wasn't that because of how the bodies were dismembered and the more work we did on that. But the team becomes electric. We knew because we had two bodies that we had a serial killer.
With two definite victims, but not one complete body, Camden was facing heading into the new year with a killer at large. At the end of December 2002 in Camden, London, there were now multiple teams of police on the street searching for a serial killer.
There was no mention of any potential suspect at all. The hypotheses that were being formulated by individual officers and the senior investigating officer is really, very, very loose at this point because there is no direction. We're looking for that direction, somewhere to go. The most important thing of that is the identification of the victims. If you can't identify your victim, then it's going to be doubly hard to find where the homicide actually took place.
The reaction inside Camden around the college was, this is an absolute tragedy and these are human beings. This is just terrible. What's happened on the doorstep. Don't care who they are. This is awful.
On the streets, inquiries were continuing as police teams combed through the contents of every bin in the area.
It was decided that the specialist search officers should go to the landfill site where Camden Borough sent all of their commercial, public and domestic waste. It's a massive undertaking. 80 officers, 3 weeks sifting through tons and tons of rubbish.
As the search for physical evidence began, other officers were looking for witnesses.
House to house is something that is seen as a bugbear by many officers, knocking on doors. You've always got to do that initial introduction. People want to know more than you can really tell them. And it would start with, there's been an incident, do you know who uses those bins, have you used those bins, who lives next door?
While emptying all the bins in the local area, the police made another disturbing discovery.
A search also turned up a bloodstained bra. That bloodstained bra was found in the bins that belonged to a particular flat. The occupier of that flat was one Anthony Hardy.
Anthony, or Tony Hardy, was already well known to the police. He had been arrested at the start of the year.
He had been arrested earlier in 2002 for criminal damage to a neighbour's front door where they had had a dispute over a leak. The dispute continued. He was assertive, aggressive, and then he had scrawled something on the neighbour's front door.
This was in the same block of flats where they had just found the body parts. Following the dispute, the neighbours had called the police.
The police went to that flat, they got the account of what had happened, including the history, that he was a big, burly guy and really in your face when you argued. They went to Hardy's flat, he was in. They went inside and they noticed that one of the doors was locked. When they said to him, have you got a key for that door that's locked? He said, no, I can't find it.
As Hardy was acting suspiciously, they searched him and discovered the key.
So the officers get in through that door, and there's sadly the body of Sally Rose White on the bed. They then immediately seal the scene. They arrest Hardy for suspicion of murder as well as criminal damage, and then the post-mortem is carried out.
Sally Rose White had shared the flat with Hardy. Now, she was dead. Nightmare neighbour Anthony Hardy had suddenly become a potential killer, and the news soon caught the attention of locals.
They had found a body in his flat of Sally Rose White. It hadn't been extensively reported in the paper, but the people knew about it.
Although Sally White's body had been found in suspicious circumstances, police needed to identify a cause of death before bringing charges against Hardy.
Hardy, when interviewed, said, "I was drunk, he had an alcohol problem. I woke up and she was dead." That post-mortem did identify the injuries to Sally, and it also stated that Sally Rose White had died from natural causes from a heart attack. She had some congenital problem that was identified, and she had died from that.
As Sally was deemed to have died naturally, no charges relating to her death could be brought against Hardy.
I covered the inquest at the time. That was a few months after she had been found in Hardy's flat.
I went to the Crown Prosecution Service, where it was decided there was no case to answer for murder or any injuries to Sally Rose White. However, there was always that nagging doubt.
Police officer came to court, read out some details. The pathologist's report, which said she had died from natural causes, was deemed to be the most important thing here, and the coroner closed up and said, right, there's nothing suspicious here, there's no foul play, and that was it. And the police afterwards said, well, if the coroner and the pathologist say it's natural causes, then we're not here to investigate natural causes, we're here to investigate murders.
He was charged with criminal damage for the scrawling on his neighbour's door. He went to court and he was remitted to a mental hospital for treatment. He wasn't in for long though.
He'd been sectioned afterwards, and then he had returned to the estate. He'd gone straight back to the same flat and carried on as if nothing had happened. And he's still the same neighbours that he'd had been in dispute with were still living there. So they were naturally, I think, uneasy about what might have gone on when the police turned up soon after Christmas.
Anthony Hardy had been released in November, 7 weeks before the dismembered bodies were found near his flat. Anthony Hardy became a significant person of interest.
We soon found out that Tony Hardy lived alone, that he was not seen in the area at the immediate time. That picture is becoming clearer and clearer. All the fingers are pointing at Tony Hardy.
And it was decided that they would knock on his door, armed with a warrant to search it in any case, but to see what happened and also to see if he was there, because he was a fairly obvious suspect at that point.
The evidence was mounting. The team decided to search Anthony Hardy's flat.
The officers engaged in house to house, knocked on the door of flat 4, and actually the door was open.
We effected entry into that flat, and I think the first thing that confronted the officers was the darkness. And that was darkness in colour as well as feeling. He had icons, satanic icons in the flat. He had lots of pornography. It was dark walls, a grubby bathroom, and this closed bedroom door.
The officers went in. When they entered the room, they found something wrapped in bin liners. On top of those bin liners on the floor, next to the bed, a hacksaw and 3 knives. Had the appearance almost of an altar.
When they carefully opened the bin bag, they could see it was another torso of a woman. They then secured the scene. The flat was now a scene. We already thought it was a scene, but they secured it properly, and they went through the forensic process.
There are no carpets on the floor, there are paintings on the floor, there are paintings on the wall, some of which make sense, some of which don't. There's graffiti on the walls, graffiti on the doors. It's not a pleasant place to go into.
We hadn't identified the person that was in the bedroom, and it was transported to the mortuary for a post-mortem. We had the items used for dismemberment. I can recall one of the officers telling me that they could see on that hacksaw that it looked like little bits of skin. And then as we worked from the bedroom outwards, we then were able to gather other evidence that proved important. A devil's mask.
With photographic equipment and a satanic mask in the flat, it looked as though Hardy had been making some form of sadistic pornography with his victims.
The living room has a sofa. It has actually 3 TVs in it. A coffee table. Again, there are paintings on the walls. There are graphics that will probably mean something. There is lots and lots of debris around. The 3 TVs are hooked up to video recorders, and all the video cassettes basically are pornographic. And it's my understanding that Hardy would sit there with his friends and watch pornographic movies.
From just simply looking at the crime scene itself, this was a bizarre place. This was not some comfortable residence for a normal person. This is not the indulgences of a normal person who perhaps has a few sexual problems. This is someone who engages in sadistic activity, someone possibly with a psychopathic propensity and indifference to the victim as an object, but someone who requires a lot more than simply sex. Possibly frustrated.
With a warrant to search the whole house, police used chemicals and UV lights to look for evidence.
One of the forensic decisions that was made was that luminol should be used at the scene.
Luminol is used to locate blood at a crime scene. How this works is that the iron in the hemoglobin in blood, even if it has superficially been cleared away, will react with the luminol to create something called a chemiluminescence, or a glowing, and this can then be photographed to detect areas where blood may be present or may have been present in the past.
The bathroom yielded presence of blood splatters and blood in the bath. So he definitely had dismembered one or both of those women in the bath area.
The bloodstains that were found as a result of the luminol were identified as our 2 victims and also an unidentified female.
Anthony Hardy was prime suspect for these multiple murders that would soon be referred to as the work of the Camden Ripper. In Camden, North London, New Year's Day 2003 was day 3 of a multiple homicide investigation, and police were searching the home of their only suspect, Anthony Hardy.
We'd found more body parts. We found the flat. We identified what was going on or what went on in there. The focal point being identifying the victims, the post-mortem outcome from that, cause of death. And on day 3, we identified one of the victims as Elizabeth Fallad.
With only a torso and one leg, the pathologist had used some unusual techniques to identify the body.
She had implants, breast and buttocks, and she was actually identified by a serial number on one of her buttock implants, which was unique to where it came from, how it was processed, and how it was implanted to Elizabeth. And then obviously we followed up with other forms of identification as well, DNA, etc.
Body parts were first found on a Monday, and on a Thursday of that week, Anthony Hardy's name was circulated because he had left his flat. More body parts had been found in there, hacksaw had been found in there. He was obviously the main suspect, the person the police wanted to speak to.
The flat had also contained evidence that Hardy had been taking sadistic pornographic images of his victims.
The perpetrator here clearly has some form of sexual problem. Very driven to sex, but not very good at delivering it. This would be a recipe for someone who becomes obsessed with pornography, where the fantasy world can take over a great deal from the real world. This possibly would indicate that his actual killings were for the purpose of producing pornography by posing his victims in masks that make them anonymous, that make them so they could be anyone when he views them again, and they can fit into his fantasies. This is a very dangerous man.
The Met Police considered Hardy a danger to others and released his details to the press in an attempt to track him down.
We are looking for a 6 foot plus, 20 plus stone man with a beard, grey hair.
The police actually put out an appeal saying we really need to find this guy, and that's when Hardy's face was every TV channel, every newspaper, there he was.
Once we identified Hardy, we researched his background. We ascertained that he did live in Australia for a while. He's originally a Brit, highly educated, went to Imperial College London, degree in engineering, was a senior manager in an engineering company, married, had a number of children. He and his wife moved from Norfolk over to Australia, Tasmania in fact. He'd been deported from Australia because he had been arrested for domestic abuse when he had hit his wife over the head while she was having a bath, I think, with a solid lump of ice in a plastic bottle.
The perpetrator is continuously, absolutely abusive to women throughout his life. And there will be interpersonal coherence. In other words, across his life, in his domestic life, you would see that same interaction, that same bullying, violent treatment of females as you would in the killing scenarios. This is someone who gains satisfaction from dominating and harming females in a sadistic way.
The team now believed that Hardy had been targeting sex workers.
Camden, its position there was very close to King's Cross. And at that time, King's Cross was an epicentre for prostitution, for where you go for sex. It was also about the crime that was there, the drugs, the robberies, the lack of safety that people felt when travelling through that area. You know, it's just not nice to be there, but it was readily accessible for anyone who wanted to buy sex.
It was looking like Anthony Hardy regularly came to this area looking for women to satisfy his needs.
Something that we know about serial murders, and particularly sexual serial murders, is that there is often a background of extreme pornography, use of prostitutes, where it's likely that they were very rough with the prostitutes and almost acting out things that they would like to do, and also the use of very deviant fantasies.
The worst cases of sadism will end in rape. And the worst cases of those will end in killing. And the worst cases of those will end up in dismemberment as being the final, most destructive thing you could inflict on another human being.
Knowing they had a killer on the run, the Met had begun searching CCTV to trace Hardy and his last movements.
The estate is covered by CCTV, and it was on one of those cameras, local authority cameras, that he was actually pictured dumping body parts into the dustbin. Behind me, the lower windows there are the flat that Hardy used to live in. Perhaps one of the things to realise is that only a short distance in that direction, not more than 100 yards away, is where the initial body parts were found in the dustbin. So Anthony Hardy had only gone a matter of less than 100 yards before he deposited those remains.
Hardy put the body parts in the back bins and put them out. I think he probably thought that they were going to be taken away very, very quickly. But because it was Christmas, the bin rounds were delayed, so there was just that little window where the bins weren't taken away.
With a good profile of Hardy and one local sighting on CCTV, the team began to widen their net.
Because he was missing, we focused on Tony Hardy more and more. We got a description of him, we got pictures of him, we circulated it to police. We knew he needed insulin and other medicine, so we circulated to local hospitals.
Police feared that if Hardy didn't have his medicine, and if he was drinking, he could be more dangerous than ever.
We see these individuals who are suffering in some way with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, personality disorder, schizophrenia. They self-medicate, which actually, of course, particularly if they're taking other types of medication, can really cause some other associated problems for them and makes things a lot worse. They feel better in the short term, but it's actually making their problems much worse.
With his medical problems, police felt Hardy wouldn't stray too far from home.
The flat where Anthony Hardy lived was quickly kind of boarded up. It was, impossible to get a glimpse of what was going on inside. There was a lot of police tape there, and they had a kind of tarpaulin over the front, but we were there.
With Camden locked down, police had teams searching Hardy's other known stomping grounds.
So we're in the King's Cross area now. We're just approaching the station, the Great Northern Hotel. This is the area back in 2002 where sex workers would ply their trade. They would be streetwalkers. This is where Hardy came and met his companions, the women that he wanted sex with, the women that he paid, and as we know, the women that he abused and murdered.
When Hardy was on the run for about 3 days, I think, and there were people ringing the police, there were people ringing here saying, I think we've seen him here, I think he was seen. I think someone was actually arrested in South London because someone had cited him. It wasn't him, the guy was let go. Someday he'd actually gone back to the estate and seen the police tape and then gone away quickly.
He popped up where we missed him at University College London. We got CCTV of him actually going in and out of the entrance. He'd shaved off his beard. We had a better description.
Police were now involved in a cat-and-mouse chase with Hardy as they began watching hospitals and places where he could get his prescription drugs.
We're now in Queen Square outside Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children, and on the 1st of January, New Year's Day 2003, Tony Hardy came here looking for his medicine. An off-duty police officer spotted him, recognised him, phoned 999 because he was off duty. Police arrived. Hardy realised that he'd been spotted, ran into the garden area around the back, and 2 officers who turned up gave chase, caught him, and he put up a tremendous fight. He had a small knife that he stabbed one of the officers in the hands, damaged his eye socket, and the other one he knocked out, but the one that was more injured, rather than being knocked out for a few minutes, held on to him. Other police arrived because it had come up Hardy's at the hospital. Fortunately, a lot of police officers in the area, New Year's Day, quieter for the police, so they were able to respond and catch him.
It was no great surprise that Hardy had stayed local and he was arrested nearby. You generally find, because it's his comfort zone and there are places he would know and be comfortable with, he would either stay or go somewhere where he wasn't comfortable that would be miles away.
He was arrested on Thursday night, I think, and charged over the weekend. So during that time, everybody was trying to find out who this guy was.
The press were aware, so we agreed with some of them who we knew that we would give them a fuller story in a fullness of time. And as soon as he was found in a children's hospital, the news took another spin.
The reaction when he was arrested and charged was, I guess, relief, because this when are they going to find him question had finally been answered. But also about this time it was kind of being revealed about the first death in his flat, and people were putting 2 and 2 together and saying that it all fits together now.
New Year's Day 2003, Hardy had been arrested outside Great Ormond Street Hospital in London.
I got the phone call around 9 p.m. My job was to allay other senior officers that we've got the person, publicity around we've caught the person, people can relax, sex workers in King's Cross, this person's not a large, and making sure that that's all in place.
Anthony John Hardy, in the way that he committed these appalling crimes, has exhibited a degree of depravity that I personally have never ever come across before.
And there's one other important thing as well, and that's making sure that our family liaison officers can let the families know that we've caught the person. So that had to be done. There's a great sense of relief. It's captured. Euphoric, maybe not.
When Anthony Hardy was arrested, it was a huge relief to the investigation team, mainly because it meant that he could not commit further offences. That was always the danger, and it preyed heavily on the senior investigating officer's mind that there could be further victims.
Hardy was taken to Colindale Police Station. Once he was in custody, SIO Kenny Bell realised their suspect wasn't in the best of health.
He was seen by a doctor. He had to go to hospital because the doctor thought that he had gangrene on one of his legs. We took him to a local hospital in Edgware where the nurse washed his leg and said it was dirt. But that shows you the type of life that he lived, and also I think shows the vulnerability and the desperation of his victims. He was a dirty individual, but he was paying. He then was interviewed over a number of hours into days. We called in a regular psychologist.
That psychologist was Julian Boone.
My involvement in the investigation, I think, was because of my background as a specialist in sadomasochism and in necrophilia and in cannibalism. Anybody who's interviewing Hardy or his ilk should know or be warned about what they're getting out of it so that they can effectively not be hoodwinked.
With psychologist Julian having briefed them, officers faced Hardy in the interview room.
You are focusing on the interview, and it's very professionally done. Not only have you got the two officers conducting the interview, you've got others that are observing. It's the heavy lifting of any case. And also, you know, especially when you had the magnitude of evidence against someone like Tony Hardy, he decided to say no comment, which is his right.
Do you know that bin at all? No comment. Have you ever used that bin, Tony? No comment. Have you ever gone to that bin at all? No comment. Ever put any rubbish in it? No comment. Ever taken any rubbish out of it? No comment.
In my experience around interviews, you can't trick people, you can't threaten people, you can't duress people, but sometimes move away from that question. So start talking about their personal life, what they're interested in, just to see if they will talk to you. Hardy talked to the police outside the interview, so we even considered, should we use someone else to see if he would open up? Hardy decided no comment, and he kept to no comment, and we were never going to budge him.
With Hardy saying nothing, the investigation continued, beginning with trying to identify the second victim.
In cases of dismemberment such as this, a skeletal inventory will first be put together to determine, in fact, how many individuals have been found, whether that be one or more. Once the remains have been identified as belonging to a single individual, which will usually be done using DNA profiling or perhaps blood group analysis, the remains...
DNA was found on knives and the hacksaw that was found sitting on top of Elizabeth Vallad's torso in the bedroom.
Police also reopened the case of Sally White, who had been found dead in Hardy's flat in January 2002, almost 12 months before.
As a result of the investigative process, the unexplained death of Sally Rose White was revisited and re-investigated. The opinion of the pathologist in revisiting the post-mortem was that it was more than likely that Anthony Hardy had also killed Sally Rose White.
What staggers me about this case is how the perpetrator managed to evade justice by cunning, by luck, by a cloud of mental illness, and the fact that it happened partly within our own justice system. As I say, it staggers me.
When we look at the murders and we look at the behaviours that were taking place, this individual will fall into the category of sadistic serial killer. So the necrophilia, the activities that were taking place with the body, he would fall into that category. And what this tells us is that a sadistic serial killer, according to research, is more likely to repeat the offence.
By the end of the year, Anthony Hardy had been christened the Camden Ripper by the press and faced trial for multiple homicides.
Once interviews are complete, decisions made to charge, he's charged, his fingerprints, photographs are taken, a short statement is put to the media.
Hardy was eventually charged with all 3 murders: Bridget McLennan, Liz Valad and Sally Rose White. He was due to stand trial at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in November 2003. The investigation was prepared for a not guilty plea. Witnesses were warned. The evidence was finely tuned and honed and ready to be submitted to the courts. On the day of the start of the trial, Hardy changed his plea and pleaded guilty to all 3 murders.
And he pleaded guilty with no intimation that he was going to do that beforehand. And surprise, maybe you always think that some might, but he pleaded guilty. The facts of the case were presented by counsel.
These terrible details were read out to the court about how he had photographed the victims after they had died and dressed them in demonic masks. So he'd pleaded guilty. The prosecutor outlined what they thought had happened, what he had admitted to, and then there was brief mitigation, and then that was it. He was convicted. He looked around at all of us and kind of just walked out, and that was it.
The reaction amongst the team when he pleaded guilty and was sentenced is, we knew it anyway, we've done our job, and let's hope life means life.
Anthony Hardy was given 3 life sentences, and that life sentence is a life means life sentence. There's no prospect of release for Anthony Hardy.
It wasn't obvious at the immediate time back in November 2003. It wasn't until 2010, until the rules changed, the judge reviewed it and said, no, in this case, life means life.
A man who murdered 3 women and mutilated 2 of their bodies has been jailed for life. Anthony Hardy, who's 53, had been released from a psychiatric hospital because staff didn't consider him to be a danger. But he'd already committed 1 murder, and a month after his release, committed 2 more.
He didn't voice this, but we all know he was a serial killer. He was a vindictive, nasty individual that went beyond just murder.
All detectives involved in those investigations see and touch and smell and hear things that nobody should have to do. I think the biggest thing with Hardy, personally, was that I don't think it's the first time he's done it. In fact, in my heart of hearts, I know it's not the first time he's done it.
I think for people who are around Camden at a time, the Camden Ripper killings will always be, they won't forget them. They won't forget what happened that Christmas.
How I would describe Hardy, would I describe him as evil? Yes, that is one word I'd use for him. Intelligent, cunning, desperate, nasty, perverse, caught.
Tonight on Dateline.
When a murder is discovered.
She was in the bathtub where the killer had placed her. It just looked bad.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now and they say they've never got over it, what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
That was our hope, that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
The absence of a head or hands in an investigation like this can impede identification, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible.
In this episode, a 38-year-old woman goes missing, but is believed to have been killed.
It was a massive shock, a real shock, I think, for a small city like Exeter to think that something like this could have happened.
We deal with dead bodies all the time, however, not many are in this condition.
Meet the murder detectives.
What you have is a young lady who is in a suitcase which has been deposited on a railway embankment and covered over by twigs and other foliage.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
It was DNA, it was phone analysis, it was forensics. The police brought an arsenal of investigative tools.
The cathedral city of Exeter in Devon lies on the picturesque River Exe and has been an important centre for the area since Roman times. On August the 8th, 2016, a seemingly routine report came in to Exeter Police Station.
We were working on the evening that the missing person report was passed to us to look at, due to finish at 10 o'clock, and like a lot of police shifts, sometimes things don't go as you expect. You're never quite sure what's going to happen, what's going to come in, and it's one of those evenings, and something didn't look right from the outset.
Detective Darren Webb and Deputy SIO Martin Sutcliffe picked up the case 2 days later.
I was approached about a missing person called Gagana Prodanova, and the fact that there were certain concerns and worries about whether or not it was simply a missing person inquiry or whether or not we had something more sinister.
Martin and Darren were told the missing woman was a 38-year-old Bulgarian called Gagana Prodanova. She worked at a local hotel. Xenia Nikolova was a friend and colleague from the hotel.
She shared a lot of things from her life before England. In general, she was pretty chatty. Each morning when I go online to check on messages, if anything happened overnight, I got a message from her, which was really bizarre. Just reading it was so weird. There were so many things that doesn't match. And she was telling me that her mom passed away and everything happened so quickly, so she flew back to Bulgaria and she doesn't know when she's going to be back.
The text message didn't ring true. When Gagana didn't turn up for work, Xenia tried to call and left several messages, but she didn't respond.
We all start worrying. As on the movies, we just had to wait 72 hours and we phoned the police.
Exeter is regarded by locals as a safe place to live. The case was treated seriously.
This is coming into Exeter city centre. Crime levels are managed, I think, really well. There are challenges and there are areas of crime that always need to be looked at and addressed, but relatively I would hope people would enjoy living in Devon and Cornwall.
Anne-Marie also worked at a local hotel and had heard about Gagana's disappearance.
You don't hear of things like that in Exeter. Very, very rare you hear of things like that. It's very safe. You can walk the streets of Exeter very safely 10, 11 o'clock at night. It's a very nice place.
When Martin took on the case, Gagana had been missing for 4 days.
This is the major incident room at Exeter, and when a case breaks, like it did in Gagana's case, obviously it requires an awful lot of attention and a number of police resources, so they'd all converge in this room.
They began a proof of life investigation, which looks at the missing person's lifestyle to see if there had been any recent abnormal activity.
The vast majority of the information, and particularly when you looked at a lady that had a lot of contact with people in Bulgaria and phone calls being made, all that had stopped. And this is a lady with 3 children. That in itself was extremely worrying.
The team learned that Gagana's 3 children were being looked after by their father's family in Bulgaria, while she was working in the UK.
She said that financially they struggle in Bulgaria and the mother is not very well, so they needed more money to cover bills and everything, to take care of the family. So that's why she came over.
Gagana had separated from her partner and had come to the UK. She had been in the country for less than 8 months.
We found Gagana to be nothing other than a very hard-working individual. Everybody would say that about her. She was very dedicated to her job. She would work hard. She loved her children and she loved her family.
Gagana simply wouldn't not turn up to work. By this stage, she'd not turned up for a few days. So all these things obviously were of concern and were part of a consideration as to what we should then do.
Martin began to trace Gagana's last movements. She had a boyfriend in Exeter, so he brought him to the station for questioning and asked him to confirm when he had last seen Gagana.
The new partner gave a full and open account about their plans for that particular day.
Gagana was going food shopping, then planned to see her boyfriend to cook dinner for him, but she hadn't turned up.
The first message he received was around the time that they were due to meet, and that message was certainly written in haste and littered with mistakes, and didn't seem to make sense to him at that time.
Martin made a note of the strange message and checked out the boyfriend's story.
Everything that he mentioned seemed to fall into place when he spoke to other people that had contact with Gagana.
It looked like the boyfriend was not going to be able to provide any leads about Gagana's last 24 hours.
The last person to see anybody alive is really significant in an investigation because they hold a lot of information.
Devon and Cornwall CID had taken statements from Gagana's friends and colleagues, which revealed worrying information about her relationship with the father of her children, a man called Kostadin Kostov.
She suffered a lot in her life, like in the family, being abused physically, and her partner, I should say, he's been abusive like all their life together.
Gagana and Kostov had been together for more than 15 years in Bulgaria, but she had left him to start a new life in Exeter.
The general public tend to believe that abusive relationships evolves around primarily physical violence, whereas actually that's not the case. In a large amount of cases, it can be psychological, so where the perpetrator is controlling the victim through intimidation, coercion. Gaslighting, for example, is where the victim can be so convinced that they are in the wrong that their perception of reality completely changes.
The team discovered 42-year-old cleaner Kostov was no longer living in Bulgaria. He had followed Gagana to the UK and moved himself into her tiny bedsit. He too was brought in for questioning.
When Kostadin Kostov was interviewed, what he was saying to police was Gagana did come home, he remembers that. She was in possession of shopping, but what he went on to say was that she took a phone call when she was there. And once she took that phone call, her demeanour changed, and she explained to him that her mother had died in Bulgaria, and so she needed to leave in order to sort out, obviously, that family matter. He also went on to say that he had given her £250 in order to help her make her way.
As with the boyfriend's story, the detectives thoroughly checked out Kostov's version of events.
And we looked at financially. She was actually paid a lot better than he was. And when I looked at his means to give her that money, it didn't make any sense.
That account didn't stack up, and there were immediate suspicions about his involvement in the disappearance.
With Kostov already at the station being questioned, the team investigated his claim that Gagana had left for Bulgaria.
Just looking into the timings, it wasn't possible for Gagana to get to the airport in the time that Kostadin was suggesting. Looking at her mobile phone records, seeing where text messages had been sent from, where was it at the time these messages were being sent. Those things suggested that Gagana's phone was in Exeter at the time where Kostov had said that she was on her way to the airport. It's not true. She was, at least her mobile phone was in Exeter.
They also contacted her family in Bulgaria.
And we were able to ascertain really quite quickly, and with the help obviously of the Bulgarian community, her mother was still alive.
Martin and the team looked at the evidence before them. Gagana had been reported missing 4 days ago, and the Proof of Life team had not been able to find any trace of her. Kostadin Kostov was lying about her last known movements.
That's when that decision is made. He should be arrested on suspicion of Gagana Prodanov's murder. Was certainly the fact it was a no-body murder.
Now officially a murder inquiry, Martin formed a team of officers. Head of forensics was Ivor Lloyd.
After Kostov was actually arrested, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act initially gives us 24 hours to investigate the crime. That meant there was great pressure on us to try and find something substantive forensically or Gagana or her body within that time before he had to be released.
Ivor and the team's first port of call was the flat Gagana shared with Kostov, in the hope it would reveal evidence of her life or death.
It was a small flat. It must have been very difficult living there, especially with a former partner. It was tidy. She was a hard-working lady. Didn't appear there had been much of disturbance, but of course it had been several days since the disappearance.
Her suitcase is still there. Her backpack is still there. Toothbrush is still there. There was Bulgarian currency there.
This was further evidence that Gagana hadn't left the country. But the flat didn't reveal the forensic clues Ivor was hoping for.
There was certainly no evidence of any blood pattern in the flat. What was there was the items Gagana had purchased in the shop on the night of her disappearance.
As we looked at the natural route that Gagana would have taken, we became aware of the fact she stopped at a food store on the way home.
The team found Gagana on CCTV at the shop. The ingredients she bought were in the flat, but the clothes she was wearing were not.
It made it very, very suspicious. It was evident, unfortunately, that Gagana had probably come to a tragic end.
Kostov had already been in custody for 24 hours, so the team had to apply to the magistrates' court for an extension to hold him longer without charge. If they didn't get it, Kostov would be released.
The enormity of taking on an inquiry where there's no body can't really be understated. All the inquiries you'd normally have to do obviously still exist, but you're also having to determine with absolute certainty and convince people that Gagana is no longer with us without having that physical evidence.
The magistrate granted the extension. Martin had 48 hours left to prove Kostadin Kostov murdered Gagana. Her friends were in shock that Gagana had gone.
My hopes were that he probably been so abusive to beat her up, so she cannot just show up on the next day. But she didn't show up in a couple of days, right? Sorry. This is my hope, that she's gonna be all right. Just hiding.
The press were now aware of the missing person investigation, and Martin and the team were hoping that the public might now help to build up a picture of Gagana's movements.
There was an appeal to find Gagana. We were aware that a woman had gone missing, and as a news organisation we helped as best we could. It's part of our role in these circumstances to help the police to find any information they can. We put out a picture, there was CCTV of her final movements, and we did everything we could to try and attract the public's attention to see if Gagana could be found safe and well.
We were under enormous pressure and had to work at full tilt in order to harvest as much as we possibly could.
They already had strong circumstantial evidence, but each line of inquiry would have to be investigated in greater detail.
The background of the domestic violence, the dynamic you've got, there is a motive, the lack of contact with the family. On top of that, you've got someone who is passing you false information about what has happened in the lead up to her disappearance.
Martin put a large team on to trawl 6 days of CCTV for signs of Gagana or Kostov in Exeter. Digital media investigators analysed Kostov's phone, and the Proof of Life team looked at Gagana's behaviour since her disappearance.
So as far as Proof of Life was concerned, the one potential anomaly was the fact that there were messages going out from Gagana's phone after the time that we were quite sure that she was dead.
Gagana's friend Xenia and her new boyfriend had both received messages on the night she disappeared.
The message I got is on Cyrillic, which is our alphabet, and her phone doesn't have a Cyrillic. She always uses the English alphabet.
The contact Gagana's boyfriend had with her on the night she disappeared was also unusual.
The new partner talked about the fact that there was never a voice call, and he requested a voice call. What is this message? Call me. That never happened.
Head of Forensics Ivor Lloyd had to keep all options open.
Most of our attention was trying to identify where Gagana was, where her clothing was from the night that she was wearing, where any possible weapon might be.
A laptop had been recovered from her flat, but her phone was missing.
As we start to look at the phone, it hasn't travelled anywhere, not outside of the Exeter area.
So we had a dedicated team that looked into that side of the inquiry. Through amazing diligence on their part, they were able to inform us that messages sent to both Gagana's boyfriend and work colleague Xenia had originated from the very close whereabouts of Kostov's flat. It was a revelation.
That wasn't all. The digital media investigation revealed another vital piece of evidence.
There was a SIM swap, and there was a SIM card that was placed into Gagana's phone. And the work that was done by the inquiry team showed that we could attribute that SIM card to Konstantin Kostov.
Every photograph, every message that you send, it's all data that's available for an investigator. In this case, it was beneficial to the investigation because they were able to show where he was when the phone was being used. They were able to show that the SIM card had been changed over into a different phone. And the one conclusion is that he's actually killed her, or he knows something about her death.
Martin presented this to Kostov, who was in custody.
Why is your SIM going into her handset at a time that we believe that she's dead, or certainly missing, or you're trying to purport to us that she's in Bulgaria? So those key, powerful questions were asked, and Konstantin Kostov never ever gave a satisfactory answer as to why that was the case.
As the investigation continued, Martin and the team learnt more about Gagana's life with Kostov.
She suffered all her life, gave birth of 3 kids, lovely kids, and left everything that she knows and everyone that she knows back home to go in a foreign country that she doesn't know anyone.
For her to actually move her entire life here and try and start a life would have been an enormous challenge. Could be that she was fearful for her own life. Maybe she wanted to remove herself from a toxic situation for the benefit of her children.
He was contrived, controlled, and really callous. He spoke about Gagana like she was an object.
What you have is an ex-partner who is controlling, abusive, who has come across to this country in order to seek Gagana out, is aware of the fact that there is a new relationship, and in effect what's happening is he's losing control of Gagana, and in domestic violence situations, it's a very dangerous dynamic.
He would probably most likely be starting to feel very, very desperate. When coming to England and actually moving into her flat, he probably to begin with was very likely to start to evoke power and control over it all over again. And for her, that must have been quite devastating.
Gagana's friends told police that from the moment Kostov had arrived in the UK, he had forced himself into her life.
There was an incident after a barbecue that was held at the new partner's address where he broke up her phones and I think tore up a fair amount of her clothing. Once she'd seen that, a reminder of what she'd faced in her past, that was a key turning point where she wouldn't even consider going back and didn't even stay at that address anymore because she didn't want to be around Konstantin Kostov.
The 72 hours were nearly up and they still hadn't found a body. But Martin never wavered in his belief.
We were confident we'd prove that one, Gagana had died, and secondly, that someone had taken on her identity after she died.
Martin and the team presented their case to the Crown Prosecution Service, who would decide if there is enough evidence to charge.
The CPS lawyer agreed with the police position.
Konstantin Kostov was charged with the murder of Gagana Prodanova.
We were aware that a suspect eventually had been arrested, but really we were on the outside looking in. When a major crime like that happens, Devon and Cornwall Police, the major crime investigation team, they keep things very close to their chest.
Ivor Lloyd and his forensics team continued to search for Gagana's body.
A member of the public that was travelling adjacent to a railway line in Exeter city centre smelt an unpleasant odour and reported it to the police.
Ivor went to investigate.
I arrived, parked up, and instantly could smell something coming across the road actually from all the distance. I could see down there in the undergrowth sticks and twigs stacked up but unnaturally and cut as opposed to falling off trees, and they appeared to be camouflaging something black. And when I got closer I could see it appeared to be a roll-along suitcase. From that suitcase I could see there was damage to it and there was some sort of fluid dripping from the suitcase and maggots coming out of the suitcase. It was extremely unpleasant.
Could this be Gagana's body, left to rot in the undergrowth next to the railway line? Ivor and the team were about to find out. In the Devon city of Exeter, Kostadin Kostov had been charged with the murder of his ex-partner, Gagana Prodanova.
Gagana had been missing for some period of time, and if our assessment was correct, dead for a considerable period of time.
A suitcase had been found near the railway line, and there was a rotten smell in the air. Head of forensics Ivor Lloyd concluded it was coming from the case.
I was fairly sure that something had died within the suitcase. In the circumstances we had, I started to form the hypothesis that the body within the suitcase could very well be Gagana. At that stage I didn't want to disturb anything, so I summoned CSI to photograph the scene and record it as it was. I went down to the suitcase and I pulled the suitcase out of its hidey hole up onto a flatter part of ground to see what we could see. I didn't want to open it here in the outdoors. I wanted it secured and controlled in a mortuary environment.
Ivor informed Martin and the team back at HQ of what had been found. They were hoping the suitcase could answer a lot of questions.
What can we determine about how she may have been killed? Which is why you then have obviously a forensic post-mortem dealt with by a Home Office pathologist who will go through in fine detail and try and give as many answers as they can in respect of what happened to the deceased.
We deal with dead bodies all the time, obviously, by virtue of the job we do. However, thankfully, not many are in this advanced, decomposed condition. This was extremely trying for the team, very unpleasant, notwithstanding the circumstances, but just actually the state of the body itself. Many thousands of maggots were coming out of the body bag, so it was quite a challenging post-mortem examination.
So decomposition is a continuous process of varying stages that produce different scents, different chemical compounds, different gases. We break the continuous process of decomposition down into 5 stages, the latter 2 being advanced or post-decay and moving towards dry remains.
The climate at that time and the temperature was high. She's in effect in a microclimate within the suitcase, and so deterioration is more rapid.
Once we opened the case, we could quite clearly see what appeared to be a female's body in advanced stages of decomposition inside the case.
Extended periods of decay and decomposition can inhibit the process of identification, but they don't impede it entirely. They certainly don't make it impossible. So from even dry remains, completely decomposed with no soft tissue, we can still look to establish things relating to the biological identity of the individuals.
So in the end, the identification of Gagana to the body in the case was done through DNA. We looked at the toothbrush, which we retrieved from her home flat, and then we compared it to DNA from tissue from the body, and it indeed matched, and it was Gagana.
The police activity in the area had attracted a lot of attention, and the local community became aware of their discovery.
A body had been discovered on a railway embankment in Exeter. That's when we first knew that an incident, a tragedy of some sort had occurred. What we didn't know at that stage was the background.
The team had found Gagana, but the lack of forensic evidence meant they couldn't link her body to their prime suspect, her ex, Kostov.
What you have is a young lady who is in a suitcase which has been deposited on a railway embankment and covered over by twigs and other foliage. How many cases of natural causes would end up with that scenario?
The state of the body meant that the pathologist couldn't determine much else.
We were left in a situation where actually we had no confirmed cause of death. We weren't able to say definitely how Gagana was killed or how she died.
Having now identified Gagana, Martin and the team could now tell her family and friends that she was not missing.
Most importantly, the family could have a Christian burial and could mourn their lost one in a way that they needed to. It's horrific, the news, but the position is then definite.
We expected to hear that maybe, she had gone off with someone, or, she was safe and well. But then to hear that, she had actually died, it was a real shock. Real shock.
We sent reporters to the railway embankment, the road next to where the body was found, and we knocked on doors. It's part of the journalist's job to get as much information as you can. If you can't find anything concrete out about the actual incident itself, it's common practice to ask people in the street, and of course they were worried, but the general reaction was one of puzzlement.
Officers began searching through CCTV near the railway siding, hoping to see the suitcase being dumped, while Martin continued to search the area for physical evidence.
When Gagana was found, she was naked, and so part of your consideration there is obviously where are Gagana's clothes?
They could see the clothes Gagana had been wearing at the time she disappeared on the CCTV footage from the shop she was last seen in.
We took a decision to recover what we could in the way of waste, domestic waste, in and around the area where we believe she went missing.
What happens with a lot of investigations, sometimes you need a bit of luck. The investigators in this particular case took the opportunity to stop the bin collection and then collect all the bins up and then go and search through the many tons of rubbish.
And you're going bag to bag. It takes a lot of determination and will to move through and keep your focus and concentration as it needs to be.
Their breakthrough came when they found a bin bag that contained not just clothes, but shopping bags like the ones Gagana had been seen carrying.
The actual bin bag, when they explored it, was open up, and within that was a blue bag. Its appearance was remarkably good for a match for the shopping that she got from the Best One International store.
The clothes were also a match to Gagana's.
Finding the garments that were exactly the same as Gagana was wearing on the night she disappeared was brilliant. When the items were found at the refuse tip and photographed and seized by CSIs, it became evident that they were all actually cut off the victim when she was undressed rather than just being taken off.
Within the same bin bag were other items they felt they could test for DNA evidence.
There were cans located within that bin bag as well, and a Jack Daniels bottle. So all of that potentially can harvest something for us.
Kostov was still in custody, so police continued to search the flat he shared with Gagana.
When suspects are brought in for questioning, under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, samples are collected. So these things, in this case, like swabs, would have been taken to look for any kind of DNA, perhaps blood samples. I suspect that they were looking to be able to find a connection between the suspect and either the scene of the crime or the victim.
In Kostov and Gagana's flat, officers found a pair of scissors. They, along with the cut clothes found in the rubbish bags, were sent for forensic examination.
An assessment was made by a forensic scientist about whether those scissors made those cuts, and that came back positive. In addition to that, we looked at the garments for DNA. On the leggings, we found blood which was identified as coming from Kostas.
More DNA tests were done on the beer cans found in the rubbish, again looking for a link with Kostov.
Certainly the Carlsberg can was examined to see if the drinker, if you like, could be identified, and again there was a full profile. Huge moment. That was a point where I allowed myself to be at least slightly content with the way it was going.
Martin and the team had now connected Kostov with Gagana's body. Officers examining CCTV of the area had also got a result.
The suspect was identified dragging a roll-along suitcase in the early hours of the morning away from Gagana's home address, and then quite a short time later coming back without the case.
The suitcase seems to be way above a weight which would ordinarily be involved when, well, I don't know, some people like to pack particularly heavy, but it was to the point of being ridiculous.
They were convinced the man seen in the CCTV pulling the suitcase was Kostov and confronted him with the footage.
He refused to admit this or accept it during an interview.
With the CCTV and all the other evidence found at the flat, Martin and the team felt they had enough to go to court.
You can't be 100% certain about how things are going to go.
I mean, it really was one thing after another. There were so many different areas of evidence which showed it was categorically Kostov that committed this terrible crime. Everything pointed towards him.
"38-year-old Gagana Prodanova had been found dead in a suitcase, dumped near the railway line in Exeter, Devon.
For months on end, myself, the case officer, and those at the core of the inquiry were basically working at full tilt, like a war of attrition, trying to get everything done. And it was one of the most demanding periods I've ever had in my police career.
The police had found CCTV footage that they believed showed Kostadin Kostov moving the suitcase containing Gagana's body from her flat to the railway siding.
He's not dressed in his normal clothing. He wore a baseball cap, a very tight top, and tried to present physically in a different way to what he ordinarily would be seen on the CCTV.
So we know that when Costin dumped Gagana's body over the embankment, that he was caught on CCTV walking away, almost strutting and looking almost pleased with himself. I think what we have to remember is it's not necessarily the act of murder that he's feeling pleased about. It's the fact that he has, in his mind, been able to regain power. He's been able to regain control over her.
They didn't consider it could be somebody else. Plus the fact the individual coincidentally walks the vast majority of the distance back to the home address of Kostin Kostov, all that obviously helps paint a picture of who may be responsible.
With this video evidence, Kostov's DNA found on Gagana's abandoned clothes, and proof Kostov had been using her phone, the police felt they had enough to try him for murder.
So after months of preparation and getting the case together, obviously we moved to the trial phase, and this trial was held at Exeter Crown Court.
On April the 20th, 2017, in Exeter Crown Court, the trial began.
The murder trial in Exeter is a big event. It was an extraordinary case because there were two bombshell moments. The first being when the prosecution showed the CCTV of Kostov walking through the town in the dead of night with the suitcase with a body inside it.
It's obviously a very unusual event that someone to choose to take a dead body through a city centre at all. I think there was an element of thought and planning around it, because people walking through this city with suitcases is not that unusual an event. There are a huge number of cameras available to us, which obviously are very useful when you're carrying out criminal investigations.
When Kostov was confronted with the CCTV image of the man with the suitcase, his lawyers said that as no face was visible, it couldn't be proved it was Kostov.
With a view to getting him in trouble.
The only trouble in this investigation was that he was going to be arrested for her murder. He did try and suggest that whilst at the flat, it must have been Gagana or another that were actually sending messages.
When the prosecution said, "How on earth do you expect us to believe that it was Gagana sending these messages?" He was the person sending them all along, it was obvious. And to suggest that Gagana was still alive sending messages in her name was ridiculous, to be honest.
After the prosecution had laid out their case, Kostov himself gave evidence in his defence.
It's always a high point of a trial when the defendant gives his evidence, because you know very quickly after he opens his mouth and answers these allegations whether or not he's got a case or not.
The way he spoke in there, on occasions he broke into a smile and a laugh whilst being questioned. That's the person that you're dealing with. That's unbelievable. There was an arrogance there. Did he think he could pull this off? Some people have that narcissistic type of personality where they think, I'm the smartest individual in the room, I will work my way through this. I've done it before, I'll do it again.
He just would not budge from his view that it must be somebody else that he did it. He always seemed to portray that he was a victim somehow of this entire scenario and that everything was Gagana's fault.
By tracking Kostov's phone and those movements with the CCTV footage, police showed he had returned to the suitcase some days after it was dumped.
It was explained that Kostov had returned to the scene of where the suitcase was, and he'd made this search on his phone using the Bing search engine.
The most powerful piece of evidence, arguably, and the impact you could see it had in the court came from the Bing search that was conducted by him on his mobile phone. How long does it take for a human corpse to decompose?
Lord knows what he was thinking when he made this search, because the police, when they went back to examine the evidence, could clearly look at his search history, because he was at the scene where the body was. He was standing literally metres away from where Gagana was decomposing in a suitcase. So why would you make that search? Well, you can imagine how explosive or damning that is as a piece of evidence when the jury hear that.
The court case took 5 weeks. In the end, it was down to the jury to decide whether Kostov was guilty of the murder of Gagana.
One of the challenges is that you almost have to be able to demonstrate how somebody died. Gagana's body was found in a suitcase, so it was quite clear that it wasn't natural. So that in itself helped. They can't say that it's a murder because there's no sign of violence, but by the same token, is it an accident? It's quite clear she was murdered. It's quite clear that she was put into a suitcase and transported to that location, to the deposition site. It probably wasn't as big an issue because of those reasons that they couldn't establish how she died.
So I was there for the duration of the trial. Trials are always very nerve-wracking experiences.
I think he possibly did think he could get away with it. I don't think he had any sense of the reality of standing in a witness stand in the UK trying to prove yourself to a jury of 12 men and women when you're faced with such a compelling case. At every stage when the prosecution presented its evidence, he was simply moving a step closer to the prison cell.
Once all the evidence had been heard, the judge sent the jury out to consider their verdict.
It's almost like you take a breath. The dynamic has changed. You've gone through, you've done everything you possibly can.
I've sat through hundreds of trials, and you never know until that verdict comes whether or not the jury sees the case in the way that you see it. A person's liberty is at stake here. Everything has to be taken seriously. So when the verdict is delivered, it is high drama, it's pure theatre in a sense.
Under 90 minutes later, they came back into court and were unanimous in a guilty verdict.
It really was such a strong case, and so the relief is even greater because it would just be a horrendous miscarriage of justice if he was able to walk the streets knowing what we knew about him in the fullness of Kostov's character. It just wouldn't have been right. Any other verdict other than murder and guilty.
The motive for this case was as old as the hills. It was jealousy.
If he couldn't have her, obviously no one else could. And that's the unfortunate thing. But he's in the right place, and I think we all feel a lot safer that he is there.
And maybe people will learn something from this case, let's say it. People should not accept abuse, mental or physical abuse. You should change it, immediately cut it off. Don't wait for something bad to happen.